honest story.
Elijah Carter, a fearless investigative journalist known for exposing corruption. Smart, determined, and willing to risk everything for the truth. Detective Vincent Kane, a high-ranking officer in the New Haven Police Department. Ruthless, arrogant, and deeply entrenched in corruption. Officer Ethan Brooks, Kane's right-hand man, younger but just as dangerous. Loyal to the corrupt system and willing to do anything to protect it. ADA Caroline Foster, the ambitious assistant district attorney, determined to win cases at any cost. She is aware of the corruption but chooses to turn a blind eye. Dominic Hayes, a seasoned defense attorney, sharp and methodical. He has taken Elijah's case, knowing the odds are stacked against them. Samuel Lewis, an elderly witness who holds the key to the truth. Courageous despite his age, he refuses to let fear silence him. Chief Harrison Graves, the chief of police, the man pulling the strings behind the corruption, ensuring that those in power stay untouchable. Opening graph. The courtroom was a battlefield, though no weapons were drawn. The tension in the air was thick enough to suffocate, pressing against the walls of the packed chamber. Every seat was occupied, every pair of eyes locked onto the defendant, a man whose presence alone sent ripples through the foundations of the city's elite. Elijah Carter sat at the defense table, his wrists still marked by the tightness of the cuffs that had bound them only moments ago. His face remained impassive, unreadable, though his mind was anything but still. He had spent years exposing the truth, peeling back the layers of corruption that strangled the city, and now, they were trying to bury him for it. Across the room, Detective Vincent Kane leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his broad chest. The smirk playing at his lips was one of a man who believed himself untouchable. Beside him, Officer Ethan Brooks tapped his fingers against the table, his confidence mirroring that of his superior. They had played their hand well, fabricated evidence, twisted narratives, a trial designed to paint Elijah as the villain. They believed they had won. They believed they had silenced him. But they had no idea how wrong they were. The judge's gavel struck wood, commanding silence over the murmuring audience. "Court is now in session," came the firm voice of Judge Eleanor Whitmore, a woman known for her stern approach to justice. Her gaze flickered to Elijah, assessing, then shifted to the prosecution. ADA Caroline Foster stood gracefully, smoothing the lapels of her pristine blazer. She was composed, methodical, a woman who knew how to mold a narrative that juries wanted to believe. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, met those of the jury as she began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we are not here to discuss rumors. We are not here to entertain conspiracy theories," she started, her voice steady and rehearsed. "We are here because a man, one who has repeatedly shown contempt for law enforcement, chose to interfere with an ongoing police investigation, escalating a routine situation into an act of aggression." She turned, motioning toward the defense table. "The man you see before you, Elijah Carter, is not a hero. He is not a protector of truth. He is a disruptor, a man who has spent his career antagonizing the very system that seeks to maintain order. And today, we will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that his actions were not those of a concerned citizen, but of a man who believes himself above the law." A murmur ran through the gallery, some nodding in agreement, others whispering in protest. Elijah remained still, his hands clasped together, his mind cataloging every word. This was the opening act of a carefully staged play, one where the prosecution had already written the ending. But what they didn't know was that Elijah had rewritten endings before. His attorney, Dominic Hayes, slowly rose to his feet, his expression unreadable but his eyes holding a quiet fire. He buttoned his jacket and turned to the jury, taking his time before speaking. "There is an undeniable power in storytelling," he began, his voice smooth and commanding. "Miss Foster just told you a story. One crafted with precision, designed to make you believe that the man sitting before you is guilty before you have even heard the evidence." He let the words settle before continuing. "But here's the thing about stories, they rely on perspective. And today, we're going to give you a different perspective. One rooted not in speculation, but in fact." Dominic turned to face the gallery, his eyes scanning the faces before settling on the judge. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I request that the court be made aware of evidence that the prosecution has thus far failed to produce, namely, the full unedited surveillance footage from the night in question." Caroline Foster's posture stiffened. "The prosecution has already submitted the necessary footage to the court." "Yes," Dominic countered, stepping closer to the evidence table. "A highly edited, highly selective version. But where is the full footage, Miss Foster? The footage that would provide the entire context?" The room shifted, murmurs growing louder as members of the jury exchanged glances. Judge Whitmore's gaze narrowed. "Miss Foster, does the full footage exist?" Foster hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Dominic smiled, slow and knowing. "Interesting." For the first time since the trial had begun, Detective Kane's smirk faltered. And Elijah Carter, still seated, still silent, felt the first crack in their carefully constructed facade. They had underestimated him. And that was their first mistake. The night was humid, the city streets glistening under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. Elijah Carter walked with purpose, his mind preoccupied with the story he had just uncovered. He had spent months piecing together evidence of deep-seated corruption within the New Haven Police Department, and now, he finally had enough to go public. The weight of his discovery sat heavy on his shoulders, but it wasn't fear that gripped him, it was determination. Then he heard it, a voice, frail and trembling. "Please, sir, I just want to go home." Elijah's steps slowed. He turned his head and saw an elderly man, Samuel Lewis, standing at the entrance of a rundown apartment complex. His hands clutched the metal railing as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Two uniformed officers blocked his way. One of them, Officer Ethan Brooks, held a flashlight inches from Samuel's face, while the other officer, silent, imposing, stood with a notepad in hand, jotting something down. Elijah's instincts kicked in. He had seen situations like this too many times before. He didn't rush over, he wasn't reckless. Instead, he walked forward with measured steps, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, is everything all right?" Brooks barely spared him a glance. "Move along. This doesn't concern you." Elijah didn't move. "He's a resident here. Why won't you let him go inside?" Samuel's eyes darted between the officers and Elijah, his hands trembling slightly. He clutched his cardigan tighter, as if the fabric itself could protect him from whatever came next. I live here," he murmured. "I've lived here for 40 years. Kane, who had remained silent until now, finally looked up from his notepad. His eyes met Elijah's, and there was something in them, something cold, calculated. A slow smirk formed on his lips. "You again," Kane said, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. He took a step closer, his presence towering. "You always seem to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, Carter." Elijah held his ground. "I ask questions. That's what I do." Kane chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah? Well, maybe it's time you start learning when to shut up." Elijah knew where this was going. He had seen it before. A fabricated charge, a resisting arrest claim, an escalation that would justify force. But he wasn't here to play into their hands. "I'm just making sure this man gets home safely," Elijah said, his voice even. "That's not a crime, last I checked." Brooks scoffed, shifting his weight impatiently. "You journalists. Always thinking you're untouchable." Kane's smirk faded. His hand moved toward his radio. "You're interfering with police business," he said, his tone shifting to something darker. Elijah barely had time to process the words before Kane shoved him hard. He stumbled back, catching himself before falling. "That's assault," Kane announced loudly, his voice carrying through the street. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. A woman clutched her phone tighter, recording. A man in a baseball cap shook his head. "He didn't do anything," someone shouted. But it didn't matter. Kane and Brooks had already decided the outcome. Brooks grabbed Elijah's arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced ease. The sharp snap of handcuffs followed, the cold metal biting into Elijah's wrists. He gritted his teeth but refused to struggle. They wanted him to resist, they needed him to. That would make their story airtight. As they shoved him toward the patrol car, Elijah's eyes met Samuel's. The elderly man's face was stricken with guilt and fear. "Don't," Elijah managed to say, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Don't let them scare you." The last thing he saw before the door slammed shut was Samuel Lewis, standing frozen on the sidewalk, his eyes filled with something Elijah recognized all too well, helplessness. By morning, his name would be smeared across every major news outlet. The headline would be clear: "Disruptive journalist arrested for obstructing police investigation." And what no one knew yet, what Kane and Brooks hadn't accounted for, was that they had just ignited something far bigger than they could control. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest. This was war. The courtroom had transformed into a stage, where truth and justice were mere illusions, manipulated by those who held power. The jurors sat rigid, their expressions unreadable, while the audience, a mixture of reporters, concerned citizens, and off-duty officers, watched intently. Elijah Carter, seated at the defense table, remained composed, though every fiber of his being burned with indignation. Across from him, Ada Caroline Foster moved with confidence. She was a master of her craft, and today, her craft was deception. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, stepping toward the jury, "this case is not about politics. It is not about conspiracy theories or media sensationalism. It is about one simple fact: a man who interfered with lawful police operations." She turned toward Elijah, her gaze sharp. "Mr. Carter is not a hero. He is not a defender of justice. He is a provocateur, a man who thrives on chaos, who places himself in situations where he does not belong." The jury absorbed her words, some nodding slightly. Foster continued, pacing the courtroom with practiced ease. "On the night in question, the defendant inserted himself into an active police investigation. He escalated a routine encounter, refusing to comply when officers instructed him to leave. And when they attempted to de-escalate, he became aggressive." She gestured to the evidence screen. The grainy surveillance footage flickered to life. On the screen, Elijah was seen approaching the officers, his body language calm. But then, a sudden cut. The next frame showed an officer staggering backward, his hands raised defensively. It was doctored, altered just enough to shift perception. The jury murmured. Foster turned to them. "You saw it with your own eyes. This is not a man who was merely observing. This is a man who was actively challenging authority." Dominic Hayes, Elijah's defense attorney, slowly stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution has yet to present the unedited footage. Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses. Miss Foster, does the unedited footage exist? Foster's smile barely faltered. Your Honor, the footage provided is the only version available. A convenient answer. Dominic exhaled sharply but nodded. Very well. He turned to the jury, buttoning his suit jacket. Let's talk about perspective, shall we? He walked toward the evidence screen, the doctored footage frozen behind him. This clip you just saw, it's been edited. We know this because the defense requested the full video from the city's surveillance archives, only to be informed that the original had been lost due to technical errors. He let the words hang. What a remarkable coincidence. A few jurors shifted, doubt flickering in their eyes. Dominic continued. Let's move on to the testimony of the officers involved. Detective Vincent Kane and Officer Ethan Brooks have both stated, under oath, that my client was belligerent and physically aggressive. But what if I told you these same officers have been cited multiple times for excessive force? Foster rose quickly. Objection. Speculation and irrelevant character assassination. Judge Whitmore considered, then nodded. Sustained. Keep your questions relevant, Mr. Hayes. Dominic pivoted smoothly. Of course, Your Honor. Then let's hear from an eyewitness. The heavy courtroom doors creaked open. All eyes turned as Samuel Lewis slowly stepped inside. The elderly man, frail but resolute, walked to the witness stand, his hands gripping the railing as he was sworn in. Dominic approached him gently. Mr. Lewis, can you tell the jury what you saw that night? Samuel's voice was steady. I saw a good man try to help me. Foster's lips pressed together. Samuel continued, his voice gaining strength. I was just trying to go home. Those officers, they wouldn't let me. Then Elijah came. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't violent. He just asked why I wasn't allowed inside. A pause. A breath. Then, and that's when they grabbed him. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Foster quickly stood. Mr. Lewis, given the poor lighting and your age, are you absolutely certain of what you saw? Samuel's gaze hardened. Miss Foster, I've been seeing injustice my whole life. I know exactly what I saw. Silence. A charged, undeniable silence. Dominic turned back to the jury. You heard it. You saw the footage, edited and incomplete as it was. But more importantly, you felt the weight of this case. You know what's happening here. He gestured to Elijah. This man is not a criminal. He is a journalist. And his only crime, if you can call it that, is seeking the truth. Foster had lost momentum. She knew it. Kane and Brooks sat stone-faced, their confidence rattled. Judge Whitmore cleared her throat. The jury will now deliberate. A bailiff collected the verdict form. The air was thick with tension as the jury foreman stood. On the charge of obstructing police investigation, not guilty. A sharp exhale from Elijah. The gallery erupted in gasps and whispers. On the charge of resisting arrest, not guilty. Foster's jaw tightened. And on the charge of assaulting an officer, not guilty. The gavel struck once. Case dismissed. Elijah turned to Dominic, a ghost of a smile forming. But Kane, from across the room, leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. You think this is over? Elijah met his gaze. No, he said, voice unwavering. But it's your turn to be afraid. Because justice wasn't just a word. It was a reckoning. The courthouse steps were a battlefield of their own. The second Elijah Carter emerged from the towering doors, the air was electric with tension. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust into his face, cameras flashing like gunfire. Voices overlapped, each demanding a response. "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to be free? Do you think justice was truly served today? What do you say to those who still believe you were in the wrong?" Elijah raised a hand, signaling for silence. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of a man who had just faced a system designed to break him. "This wasn't just about me," he said, scanning the crowd. "This was about every person who has been silenced, every voice that has been ignored. Today was a small victory, but the fight is far from over." Behind him, Dominic Hayes watched the scene unfold with measured caution. "We should go," he murmured, placing a firm hand on Elijah's shoulder. "This isn't over yet." Elijah nodded. He knew the truth. The trial was only the beginning. He had rattled the foundation of corruption, but the structure still stood, and its architects would not let him walk away unchallenged. As he descended the steps, his eyes locked onto Detective Vincent Kane, standing in the distance. Kane's hands were in his pockets, his stance casual, but his expression spoke volumes. He wasn't smirking anymore. He wasn't confident. He was calculating. This isn't over. The unspoken promise passed between them like a loaded gun waiting to be fired. Elijah Carter sat in the dimly lit warehouse, his wrists bound tightly behind his back, his body aching from the struggle. The smell of oil and rust clung to the air, mixing with the faint metallic tang of blood, his own, dripping slowly from a cut on his forehead. His vision swam momentarily before settling, and across from him stood Detective Vincent Kane, watching him like a predator studying its wounded prey. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Kane mused, rolling his sleeves up. "You had a chance to walk away. To live. But no, you had to keep digging." Elijah exhaled slowly, keeping his expression impassive despite the pain. "You're scared." Kane chuckled, but the sound was forced. "Scared? Of what? You?" He crouched down, bringing his face level with Elijah's. "I've crushed bigger threats than you." Elijah's lips curled into a smirk. "And yet, here we are." The detective's jaw clenched, and his fingers twitched. He wanted to strike Elijah, but something held him back. Kane wasn't just dealing with a journalist anymore, he was dealing with a symbol, a man whose name had already ignited a movement. Killing him now wouldn't silence the storm, it would fuel it. "Here's what's going to happen," Kane said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're going to disappear. Maybe it'll be an overdose, maybe an accidental fall from a building. Either way, the world will forget about Elijah Carter." Elijah met his gaze, unwavering. "You really believe that?" Before Kane could answer, the warehouse doors burst open with a deafening crash. Flashbangs. Chaos. Gunfire. Elijah barely had time to react before a pair of hands grabbed him, cutting the ropes binding him. He turned sharply, finding himself face to face with Elliot Marsh, his only ally within the corrupt system. "Move!" Elliot barked. Elijah didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing a nearby metal pipe and swinging it just as one of Kane's men reached for his weapon. The blow connected, sending the man sprawling. More officers flooded in, overwhelming the criminals Kane had surrounded himself with. Kane staggered back, his face twisting in rage. He reached for his gun, but before he could aim, Elijah was on him. Years of frustration, of injustice, of knowing that men like Kane thrived in a system designed to protect them, Elijah channeled all of it into his fist as it collided with Kane's jaw. The detective stumbled, his weapon clattering to the floor. Breathing heavily, Elijah stepped back. Around him, officers dragged Cain's remaining men into custody. Elliot crouched beside Cain, gripping him by the collar. "It's over," Elliot hissed. "You lost." Cain spat blood, but his smirk remained. "You think this ends with me?" He chuckled darkly. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Elijah wiped blood from his chin. "Then I'll keep digging." Sirens wailed in the distance. Officers swarmed the warehouse, securing the scene. As Cain was dragged to his feet, his smirk faltered, replaced by something Elijah hadn't seen before: fear. The arrest of Detective Vincent Cain and his men sent shockwaves through the city. Chief Harrison Graves, realizing the walls were closing in, attempted to distance himself, calling Cain a rogue officer, acting on his own. But Elijah had anticipated this. The morning after the raid, Elijah released the final piece of evidence: a direct link between Chief Graves and organized crime, bribes, and corruption buried under decades of cover-ups. The report was undeniable. The city exploded with outrage. A week later, Chief Graves was arrested. His empire, built on lies and blood money, collapsed overnight. Officers once loyal to him turned their backs, trying to save themselves. The city, once silent under the weight of corruption, found its voice. Elijah stood before a sea of reporters outside the courthouse, where Graves was being indicted. Microphones surrounded him, cameras rolling. "You fought against an entire system," one journalist said. "What kept you going?" Elijah glanced at the crowd. Among them, he saw Samuel Lewis, the elderly man whose struggle had set everything in motion. He saw the families of those who had suffered, the people who had been waiting for justice. He took a deep breath. Because the truth is worth it. The cameras clicked. The world was listening. A new beginning. That evening, Elijah stood on the rooftop of his apartment building, looking out over the city. The fight wasn't over. There would always be more corruption to expose, more battles to fight. But for the first time, he allowed himself to breathe. Elliot stepped beside him. "You did it." Elijah shook his head. "We did it. And we're not done yet." Elliot smirked. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Elijah chuckled. "Not when there's still work to do." As the city lights flickered below them, one truth remained. They had tried to silence him. But now, the whole world was listening. The city of New Haven was forever changed. The arrest of Detective Vincent Cain and Chief Harrison Graves sent shockwaves through the police department and beyond. The once untouchable figures of power were now in orange jumpsuits, paraded through the very courthouse where they had once manipulated the law to their advantage. The people had won, but at a cost. For Elijah Carter, the fight was far from over. His name was now synonymous with resistance, with justice, with defiance against corruption. But with that notoriety came new challenges. Public reaction and the divide. The city was split. Supporters hailed Elijah as a hero, a man who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse chanting his name, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "No more corruption." Protesters filled the streets, demanding deeper investigations, resignations, and reform within the police department. But there were others who saw him as a threat. Cain and Graves had allies, powerful ones, who weren't ready to let their empire crumble without a fight. Within the department, whispers of retaliation spread like wildfire. Officers who had once thrived under Graves' corrupt reign now found themselves exposed and vulnerable. Some resigned, hoping to escape scrutiny. Others dug their heels in, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Elijah had won a battle, but the war was just beginning. A target on his back. Late one night, as Elijah sat at his desk, reviewing the next phase of his investigation, his phone buzzed. A blocked number. He hesitated before answering. A distorted voice came through the speaker. "You should have stopped while you had the chance." A chill ran down his spine. "Who is this?" Click. The line went dead. Elijah exhaled sharply, setting his phone down. He had expected retaliation, but hearing the threat spoken aloud made it real. He wasn't just dealing with corrupt officers anymore, he was up against an entire system that had thrived in the shadows for decades. Unfinished business. Despite the threats, Elijah pressed forward. With Elliot Marsh's help, he continued to dig. The documents he had uncovered before Kane's arrest hinted at something even bigger, a network of corruption that extended beyond the police force. Politicians, business moguls, even members of the judiciary had ties to the criminal operations that Graves had overseen. If Elijah wanted real change, he had to go deeper. But going deeper meant more danger. More enemies. Dominic Hayes met with him in a secluded cafe, the weight of their conversation hanging between them. "You've done enough," Dominic said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "Kane and Graves are gone. You proved your point." Elijah shook his head. "You know this doesn't stop here." Dominic sighed. "Then be smart about it. They won't just come at you with legal threats anymore. These people, they don't play fair." Elijah knew that better than anyone. He had already been kidnapped, beaten, nearly killed. But if he backed down now, everything he had fought for would be meaningless. A message from the shadows. A week later, a package arrived at Elijah's doorstep. No return address. No markings. Just a simple manila envelope. Inside were photos, grainy, black and white images of him walking through the city, meeting with Elliot, speaking to reporters. And a single note, "We see you." Elijah clenched his fists. They wanted to scare him. To make him doubt himself. But fear was a currency he refused to trade in. Instead of hiding, he did the opposite. That night, he went live on national television. Sitting across from an investigative journalist, he laid out everything, his findings, his fears, the threats against him. He named names, exposed documents, forced the world to pay attention. "If something happens to me," Elijah said, looking directly into the camera, "you'll know exactly who's responsible." The interview went viral overnight. Suddenly, he wasn't just a journalist, he was a symbol. And symbols were harder to kill. Elliot met him on a rooftop a few nights later, the city sprawling beneath them. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said. Elijah smirked. "I've been playing this game my whole life." Elliot shook his head. "What's next?" Elijah stared out at the horizon, where the city lights flickered like stars. He had spent his life exposing the truth, fighting battles most people were too afraid to face. And now, the biggest battle of all was just beginning. He turned to Elliot, his expression unwavering. "We finish what we started." As dawn broke over New Haven, one thing was clear. The war wasn't over. But neither was Elijah Carter. The story of Elijah Carter is a reminder that truth is often buried beneath layers of power, corruption, and deception. Yet, no matter how deep the darkness, a single voice can ignite change. Elijah's relentless pursuit of justice, despite overwhelming odds, teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear but the refusal to be silenced by it. The fight against injustice is never easy, and those who stand against the system will always face resistance. But as Elijah proved, the truth has power. It disrupts, it challenges, and ultimately, it prevails, if people are willing to fight for it. His story is not just about exposing corruption, it's about resilience, sacrifice, and the price of standing for what is right. What do you think? Do you believe that one person can truly make a difference in a corrupt system? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss. Fire.